Look at the photograph. It was taken on May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, and it is one of the most reproduced images in American history. Two locomotives face each other on a thin line of iron track, their noses nearly touching. Railroad executives and engineers crowd the frame. Men in top hats and work coats, men holding champagne bottles, men shaking hands in the center of the composition with the theatrical confidence of people who know they are being recorded by history. The telegraph lines alongside the tracks are already transmitting the news to every city in the country. Done, the message read. One word, done. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The continent had been stitched together. The Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast were now connected by rail, which meant a person could cross the country in 6 days instead of 6 months, which meant goods could move from California to New York in a fraction of the time it had ever taken, which meant the American West was no longer remote and theoretical, but reachable, real, a place you could go and come back from. The locomotive engineers at the center of the photograph understood the scale of what they were celebrating. They lifted their bottles. The shutters fell. Now look at the photograph again. Count the Chinese faces. Take your time. The image is full. More than 20 men visible. Railroad company officials in dress coats. Journalists who would carry the story east. Count carefully. There are none. This is not an accident of composition. 10,000 Chinese workers, some accounts say 15,000, had built the western half of this railroad. They had blasted through the granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains with black powder and nitroglycerin when no other method worked. They had driven tunnels by hand through rock that geologists later estimated to be among the hardest on the continent. They had worked through the winter of 1866 to 1867, when the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada reached 40 feet, and men worked in tunnels beneath the snow itself, hauling wheelbarrows through underground passages while the world above them was white and buried and silent. They had laid track across the Nevada and Utah desert in summer heat that reached 120 degrees. An estimated 1,000 Chinese workers died during the construction of this railroad. The railroad company recorded their deaths inconsistently, their names imprecisely, their numbers as rough approximations rather than human tallies. 1,000 men. No photograph. No monument until 2014, when a small plaque was finally installed near Promontory Summit. 145 years after the spike. The Chinese workers who built the railroad were not invited to stand behind the executives for the photograph. Some accounts say they were ordered to finish the last few miles of track, and then step aside. The celebration was for the country, and the country had decided, before anyone articulated this out loud, that the men who built the railroad were not part of the country they had built it through. 13 years after the photograph, the United States of America passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The law banned Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States for 10 years. It barred every Chinese immigrant already in the country from ever becoming a citizen. It was signed by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882. It was the first federal law in American history to ban immigration based on race and nationality. It would not be repealed until 1943, and only then because China was an allied power and the law had become an embarrassment on the world stage. Even at repeal, only 105 Chinese immigrants per year were permitted entry. Full removal of national origin quotas would not come until 1965. 61 years. That is how long the door stayed closed. The men who built the railroad were told to step out of the photograph. Then they were told to step out of the country. The railroad carried east the politicians who voted to ban them. This is not a metaphor. It is transportation history. His name was Jianming Yuan. His American foreman called him Jim because Jianming was a sound the foreman had not bothered to learn to make properly, and Jim was close enough for a work site. Jim accepted this. He accepted many things in the Sierra Nevada that he would not have accepted elsewhere, because in the Sierra Nevada in 1867, the question was not what a man accepted, but whether a man survived, and Jim intended to survive. He was 23 years old. He had come from Taishan, in Guangdong Province, following the route that 1,000 other young men from Taishan had already taken. The Pearl River to Hong Kong, the ship to San Francisco, the hiring halls on Sacramento Street, where the Central Pacific Railroad had agents waiting with contracts already written in 2 languages. The contract promised wages. It did not promise much else, and Jim had not expected much else. The tunnels were the worst of it. The Summit Tunnel alone was 1,659 feet long, driven through granite so dense and unyielding that the Central Pacific's initial estimate of 6 months drilling time proved catastrophically wrong. 2 years. It took 2 years. Chinese workers drilled from both ends and from the top simultaneously, working by candlelight in 3 rotating shifts that never stopped. The sound inside was the sound of hammers on iron and iron on granite, constant, reverberating, the mountain giving back every blow as an echo. Black powder worked. It was slow. Charles Crocker approved the switch to nitroglycerin in the winter of 1866, because nitroglycerin was faster and black powder was not getting the tunnel through the mountain at anything approaching acceptable speed. Nitroglycerin was also prone to exploding when you did not want it to explode, in circumstances that were difficult to predict, and the men who handled it had a life expectancy that declined sharply from the moment they picked up the canisters. Jim handled nitroglycerin for 3 months in 1867. He drilled the holes, packed the charge, set the fuse, got himself behind something solid, and waited. When everything went correctly, the rock face cracked and the tunnel advanced a few more inches into the mountain. When things went incorrectly, there was not always time to understand what had happened. The men he worked with had names. He knew them. Wei Guangzhen from Zhongshan, who told stories in the tunnels and could make men laugh even underground. Chen Bolin from Kaiping, who had a wife at home and a son he had never met, born 3 months after he sailed, who carried her letter folded so many times it had nearly dissolved at the creases. Liang Fuhai, 19 years old, who died in the Summit Tunnel on a January morning when a charge went too early. The railroad's records do not name him. The records say, Chinese worker, Summit Tunnel, January 1867. The record is an approximation. Liang Fuhai was not an approximation. Winter in the Sierra Nevada in 1866 was a winter that even old mountain men talked about afterward with unease. The snowpack reached 40 feet in some locations. The Chinese workers dug downward from the surface to reach the tunnel entrance, burrowing through snow to find the work they were supposed to be doing, living underground for weeks while the world above was buried. When spring came and the snowpack melted, the bodies of men who had died in avalanches emerged from the snow, still holding their tools. Jim survived the winter of 1866. He survived nitroglycerin. He survived the Summit Tunnel. He survived the descent into Nevada, where the work changed from mountain drilling to desert track laying, and where the Central Pacific and Union Pacific were racing each other toward the meeting point, with a competitive fury that workers experienced as the instruction to lay 10 miles of track in a single day, which they did on April 28, 1869. 10 miles of rail in 1 day. Jim was among the men who laid it. The last spike was gold, a ceremonial spike engraved with the names of the railroad's directors, driven at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, by Leland Stanford, a man who had not driven a spike in his life, but who understood the value of being present at a historical moment. The telegraph operator transmitted the blow. The country celebrated. Jim was 3 miles down the track, finishing the last section of rail. He had been told to finish the work. He finished the work. He did not see the golden spike. He did not see the photograph being taken. He was also, which he did not say aloud, proud of what he had built, in the way that a craftsman is proud of precise work, even when the people for whom he built it do not understand what it cost. Who decided? 2 words, but they contain a country's worth of calculation. Somebody decided that Chinese workers would not appear in the photograph at Promontory Summit. This was not a spontaneous omission. A photographer had been hired. A composition had been planned. Somebody looked at the 10,000 Chinese workers who had built the western half of the continent's most significant infrastructure project and concluded they did not belong in the image of its completion. That conclusion was made before 1882, before the Exclusion Act, before the mobs and the expulsions and the legislation. The exclusion was a legal codification of something that had already been decided, in smaller ways, by smaller people, for years before anyone put it in a statute. Jim went to San Francisco. He opened a laundry on Sacramento Street, because the laundry business was one of the few enterprises available to Chinese men in a city that restricted their employment in most other industries. He was good with his hands. He had been good with dynamite. He was good with an iron. The laundry made steady money, which is the kind of money a man who has worked in a nitroglycerin tunnel understands to be the superior kind. He wrote to his wife in Taishan every month. Her name was Su Yin, and she was 21 years old when Jim left for California. She understood the departure as a temporary arrangement. A few years, enough money to build a real house, and then Jim would come back. Or she would go to him. The Pacific Ocean in 1865 was a negotiable distance. People crossed it and came back. He sent money orders. He described San Francisco carefully. The city was sometimes difficult for Chinese men and sometimes generous. The laundry was doing well. He was saving money. He intended to bring her over. He wrote this in letter after letter through the 1870s, while the city around him was slowly changing its mind about what Chinese men represented. The 1870s were difficult in the American West. The depression that followed the panic of 1873 produced the usual results of economic disruption: unemployment, anger, and the political necessity of identifying someone to blame. Dennis Kearney was a San Francisco drayman of Irish birth who had discovered, in the economic hardship of the mid-1870s, a talent for crowd oration and a target. He stood on sandlot lots near City Hall and addressed crowds of unemployed white workers with a message that was simple, urgent, and specific. The Chinese must go. His organization, the Working Men's Party of California, made this its platform. Chinese workers took jobs, undercut wages, sent their money to China rather than spending it locally. Kearney knew the first part of this was misleading. Chinese workers accepted lower wages because they were systematically excluded from better-paying industries, not by preference. But false arguments travel faster than accurate ones when the audience is frightened and angry, and Kearney's audiences were both. Jim stood on Sacramento Street in 1877 and watched a crowd move through Chinatown. He had been warned. The warning network in San Francisco's Chinese community was swift and reliable, built from necessity. And he had pulled his iron from the fire and moved back from the window and waited. Some windows were broken. A laundry 3 doors down was set on fire. Jim watched from the back of his shop, breathing the smoke that drifted through the broken glass, and understood that the city had changed its assessment of him. In 1865, senators and railroad executives had described Chinese workers as essential to the development of the West. They said so explicitly in the congressional record. "They built the Great Wall of China, didn't they?" Charles Crocker reportedly said when asked if Chinese workers could handle the mountain work. This was not a compliment. It was a calculation. Chinese workers were recruited because they could be paid less and worked harder and had fewer options for collective action, because they were far from home and had contracts and debts to the labor brokers who had arranged their passage. 17 years later, the same Congress passed a law calling them a menace to American civilization. The narrator has read the congressional debates. It is instructive. Rock Springs, Wyoming. September 2nd, 1885. White miners attacked the Chinese community. 28 Chinese men were killed. 15 more were wounded. 79 homes and businesses were burned to the ground. Several hundred Chinese residents fled into the surrounding desert, where they remained for days before federal troops arrived. No one was convicted. 28 killed. 0 convictions. The Tacoma method followed in October of the same year. The mayor of Tacoma organized the forcible expulsion of every Chinese resident of the city. A mob moved through Chinatown, ordered residents out of their homes, marched them to a railroad station, loaded them onto a train. Their homes and businesses were burned behind them. The mayor sent letters to other Western cities describing the method and inviting them to adopt it. Some did. Over 200 documented incidents of anti-Chinese violence occurred in the American West between 1850 and 1906. The Chinese Exclusion Act was signed on May 6, 1882. President Arthur had initially vetoed a version of the bill as too extreme. The original proposed a 20-year ban, which Arthur considered a violation of the Burlingame Treaty the United States had signed with China in 1868, guaranteeing Chinese subjects the right to travel to and reside in the country. He was not a champion of Chinese rights. He was a careful man who understood treaties. Congress reduced the term to 10 years. Arthur signed the revised version. The act prohibited Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States for 10 years. It barred all Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. It required Chinese residents already in the country to carry certificates proving their legal status. Merchants, teachers, students, and diplomats were nominally exempt. Laborers were not. The distinction between a merchant and a laborer was determined by immigration inspectors applying a standard flexible enough to be applied however they chose, and they often chose to apply it broadly enough to exclude most people who tried to enter as merchants. Jim could not become a citizen. He had lived in California for 17 years. He had worked in the Sierra Nevada, survived the Summit Tunnel, opened a business, paid taxes, obeyed the law. He could not belong here. The law said so explicitly. He could not bring Su Yin from Taishan. The act barred the wives of Chinese laborers from entry. Jim was a laundryman, a laborer, and Su Yin was therefore excluded. He wrote to her explaining this as gently as he could manage in written characters. He told her the law had changed. He was working on a solution. He was well. He was 45 years old, and he had not seen his wife in 17 years, and he could not become a citizen of the country where he had spent his adult life, and he could not bring his wife to him. He wrote this between the lines of letters that said only, he was well. The law separated a man from his wife by an ocean, not war, not famine, not natural disaster, legislation. A vote in a chamber he could not enter, by men whose railroads he had built with nitroglycerin and his hands. The Geary Act arrived in 1892. If the 1882 Act was the door closing, the Geary Act was the door locked and the key pocketed. The Geary Act extended the exclusion for another 10 years and added a new requirement. Every Chinese resident of the United States must register with the government and carry an identification certificate at all times. Failure to carry the certificate was grounds for arrest and deportation. The certificate had to include a photograph and physical description. It had to be produced on demand by any government official who asked. The United States required Chinese residents to carry papers identifying their race and immigration status at all times, subject to immediate deportation if they could not produce those papers. This was 1892. They called it immigration enforcement. When other countries have done this, When other governments have required specific ethnic minorities to carry identification documents identifying them as such, subject to punishment for failure to comply, we have generally called it something else. History has names for these systems. The Geary Act simply used a different vocabulary. Nellie Fong was born in San Francisco in 1891. She was an American citizen by birth, to parents who could not themselves become citizens. She grew up in Chinatown, which was not a voluntary ethnic enclave, but a survival zone. Outside its blocks, Chinese residents faced employment discrimination so systematic that most occupations were effectively closed to them, housing discrimination that made it impossible to rent elsewhere, routine harassment in parks, stores, on public transit. Chinatown was not where they wanted to be. It was where they could be. The difference is significant. Nellie grew up understanding this geography from childhood, which streets were safe at which hours, in which seasons the harassment intensified. She carried her Geary Act certificate. She was stopped on Sacramento Street in 1923 and asked for her papers by a police officer who looked at her and saw a Chinese woman, which in early 20th century San Francisco was sufficient reason to stop a person and demand documentation. She produced her certificate. She was allowed to continue. She was 32 years old and had lived in San Francisco her entire life, and her Americanness was perpetually conditional, present when she could prove it, absent when she could not, always subject to verification by someone who had not been similarly required to prove anything. This was the legal architecture of conditional belonging. Its beams were the 1882 Act, the Geary Act, the 1902 extension that made the exclusion permanent. Its walls were the alien land laws, the employment restrictions, the housing covenants. The structure had been built, law by law, case by case, over decades, and it was thorough. It covered every point of entry, naturalization, marriage, where you could live, what work you could do, and whether, when a man demanded you prove you belonged here, you could produce the required documentation. The structure was also, in the way of thorough structures, invisible to the people who did not live inside it. White San Franciscans walked past Chinatown without considering its origins. They used the laundries and the restaurants without wondering why the businesses clustered in that particular district, rather than distributing across the city as other ethnic businesses did. The exclusion was a settled question. The men who had built the railroad had been redirected. The matter was resolved. Henry Ewan was 22 years old in 1910 when he arrived at Angel Island. He was Jim's nephew, Jim's younger brother's son, who had grown up in Taishan knowing his uncle by reputation and by the money orders that arrived from California, and by the letters, which had slowed after 1900 and stopped entirely by 1905. He had decided to find out what had happened to Jim, and he had also decided that he wanted to go to America regardless, because Taishan offered a future that was clear and limited, and he preferred a future that was unclear and possibly larger. The only way to enter the United States as a Chinese man in 1910 was to claim an exemption from the Exclusion Act. Henry was not a merchant or a teacher or a diplomat. He was the son of a farmer. He was a laborer, and laborers were banned. But there was a system. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire had destroyed the city's birth records. A Chinese man born in the United States before 1906 could not have his birth record verified, because the records were ash. A Chinese man who claimed to have been born in San Francisco before 1906 could not be disproved by any official documentation. The children of such a man, even children born in China, would be American citizens by virtue of their father's citizenship. The paper sun system was not a fraud invented by criminals. It was a survival mechanism invented by families who had been systematically excluded from a country that had used them to build itself and then told them to leave. The papers were purchased. A father's identity, with the right to claim a certain number of sons, could be bought from a Chinese-American man who had established his citizen status and was willing to sell the legal identity of a child he had never had. The paper son bought the papers, learned everything there was to know about the fictional father and fictional village, and presented himself at the immigration station ready to maintain that fiction under sustained interrogation by men whose specific job was to find the lies in it. Henry's papers said he was the son of a San Francisco-born merchant named Chen Wei, with a son, Henry, named Chen Weilong in the papers, born in the village of Xiangshan on June 14, 1888. Henry was actually born in Taishan on March 3, 1888, to a farmer named Yuan Baolin. His connection to San Francisco was his Uncle Jim's laundry and the money orders from the 1870s, and the handful of letters that had described a city of hills and fog and steady work. For 6 months before he boarded the ship at Hong Kong, Henry studied. The coaching books, small pamphlets circulating through the paper Sun networks, contained detailed descriptions of villages, family layouts, business addresses, neighborhood geography. Henry's coaching book described the Chen family house in Jiangshan, 3 rooms on the ground floor, 2 upstairs, a kitchen with 4 windows facing east, a well in the courtyard, 32 steps from the front gate, a mango tree behind the main building, a neighbor named Zhou Liushan, who kept a pig. He memorized all of this: the names of relatives, the dates of family events, the layout of village streets. He carried the coaching book as far as the waters outside San Francisco Bay, and then dropped it overboard, because arriving at Angel Island with a coaching book was the kind of evidence that ended an immigration case before it began. Angel Island. The island sits in San Francisco Bay, the immigration station buildings clustered on the eastern shore, the San Francisco skyline visible from the barracks windows on clear days. It was established in 1910 as the official processing point for Pacific Coast immigrants, the West Coast equivalent of Ellis Island on the East Coast. The comparison was accurate in geography and administrative function, and deeply inaccurate in every other respect. At Ellis Island, a European immigrant was typically processed in 3 to 5 hours. Medical inspection, document review, name registration. The implicit assumption at Ellis Island was that the person arriving was probably admissible, that the country wanted them, that the processing was a formality before a welcome. At Angel Island, the implicit assumption was reversed. The person arriving was Chinese. The person arriving was therefore presumptively inadmissible, subject to a law whose design was exclusion, and the processing was not a formality before a welcome, but an interrogation before a decision that could go either way, and frequently went the wrong way. Approximately 30% of the Chinese immigrants processed through Angel Island were deported. At Ellis Island, the deportation rate was approximately 2%. Same era, same country, same ocean, same bay, the same San Francisco skyline visible in the distance. At one station, you were expected. At the other, you were suspected. The difference was race. Henry was brought into the main building at Angel Island and assigned to the men's barracks while his case was processed. The barracks were long rooms with tiers of wooden bunks, windows covered with wire mesh, walls that had been written on by every person who had waited there before him. The writing covered the walls in dense columns, Chinese characters carved into the wood with whatever the detainees had managed to keep: a nail, a comb's tooth, a sharpened chopstick. The writing was not casual. It was the writing of people who understood they might be held in a building that would be the last American ground they stood on. People who had crossed the Pacific and waited for a verdict, and wanted to leave something behind that proved they had been real, that they had thought and felt and endured something that deserved acknowledgement. The poems on the walls of Angel Island are real. They survive because in 1963, a state park ranger was preparing to demolish the old barracks and noticed the writing on the walls and reported it, and the demolition was halted. Over 200 poems survive. They speak in the language of people caught between two countries, belonging fully to neither. People who had left one home and been refused entry to another, suspended over the water, waiting for a decision that would tell them where they were allowed to be. One poem speaks of a traveler who has crossed 10,000 miles of water, only to be imprisoned in a wooden building and subjected to questioning, who waits in bitterness while the days pass, who wonders what country he belongs to, now that one has expelled him and another refuses to admit him. This feeling has a name in Chinese American history. The walls still hold the words. The men who carved those words into the wood understood that the wood might outlast the circumstances, that someone might read them later, that the reading might matter. They were right about all of this. Henry had been in the barracks for 3 days when his first interrogation session was scheduled. Inspector Orrin Stiles was 43 years old and had worked at Angel Island since the station opened in 1910. He was a methodical man with a careful way of moving through a room and a careful way of constructing questions, not in sequence, but in pattern, asking the same information multiple times in different forms, asking peripheral questions that seemed irrelevant until you understood they were triangulating toward a central point, asking about details so specific and obscure that only someone who had actually lived in the described place would know them. He had done this for hundreds of cases. He had developed a sense, over those hundreds of cases, for the moment when a story started to slip, when an answer came too fast or too slow, when a detail was precise where it should be general, when the eyes moved in a particular direction before answering a particular kind of question. He was not cruel. This is worth saying clearly because it is the more precise description of what he was. He was thorough. He believed the law was the law and that his job was to enforce it, and he enforced it with a thoroughness that made warmth beside the point. His thoroughness was the cruelty. The system had been designed to find inconsistencies in stories that could not be wholly consistent, because no person could memorize a fictional childhood well enough to survive 3 weeks of detailed questioning. The design of the system was the cruelty. Stiles was the instrument. He sat across a table from Henry with a notepad and a translator and began. How many windows in the kitchen? 4, facing east. How many steps from the front gate to the well? 32. Where does the mango tree stand in relation to the main building? Behind it, to the left of center. What is the name of the neighbor who keeps a pig? Zhou Liushan. Stiles wrote down each answer without expression. He moved through the coaching book questions with the patience of someone who had heard the coaching book answers before and was waiting for the moment the book ran out. What games did you play as a child in the courtyard? What did your mother cook on the first day of the new year? What was the view from your bedroom window? How far was your house from the village market? What sound did you hear first in the mornings? The first session lasted 4 hours. Henry came back to the barracks wrung out, his memory of the coaching book straining at its seams. He lay in his bunk and went through the details again. Kitchen windows, 4, east-facing. Gate to well, 32 steps. Mango tree, behind the main building, left of center. The names, the distances, the directions. The fictional village rebuilding itself inside his head every night, so it would still be there the next morning when Stiles asked about it from a different angle. Meanwhile, Stiles had sent a letter to San Francisco, where the claimed father, Chen Wei, was supposed to be operating a business. This was standard procedure. Immigration officials interviewed claimed relatives separately and compared the answers. Chen Wei, the real Chen Wei, who had sold Henry his papers, had been briefed on the same coaching book and knew the same answers, and his interview was scheduled for the following week. Henry sat in the barracks and waited. Men around him had been waiting for months, their cases stuck in bureaucratic review or pending the arrival of called witnesses or tied up in immigration court proceedings. that moved at their own geological pace. The wire mesh over the windows admitted light, but not air, in any satisfying quantity. The men played cards, they talked, they carried their coaching book knowledge in their heads, and did not write it down anywhere, and did not discuss it where they might be overheard. In the evenings, some men carved. Henry watched a man 2 bunks over carving a poem about the fisherman who sets out across the sea and arrives at a shore that refuses to receive him, who turns back to find the shore he left is no longer there. The man carved slowly, quietly, working by the light that came through the mesh windows in the late afternoon. When he was done, he ran his fingers over the cuts in the wood and said nothing. Henry understood that the man was not doing this for anyone in particular, but for the act itself, for the necessity of leaving evidence that he had been real, that he had felt something, that the weight and the wire mesh and the interrogations about fictional kitchen windows had not made him less than what he was. A week passed. Stiles called Henry back for a second session. This session used the Chen Wei interview results as a comparative baseline. Some answers matched. On others, Stiles asked in ways that suggested Chen Wei might have given a different answer. Whether this was a genuine discrepancy or a technique to make Henry second-guess his own memory of the coaching book, Henry could not determine. He gave the same answers he had given before. The road and the Joe house. Stiles wrote it down. 3 weeks, total. Henry's interrogation lasted 3 weeks across 6 separate sessions. Stiles went through the same material from different angles, looking for the slip, the inconsistency, the answer that contradicted an earlier answer or contradicted Chen Wei's account, in a way that could not be explained by ordinary variation. He asked about the weather at Henry's, at Chen Wei Long's 6th birthday celebration. He asked about the sound of the river near the village. He asked about which direction the front door faced in rainy weather versus dry weather, which was not a question in any coaching book Henry had studied, because it was not a sensible question. Front doors face the same direction in all weather. Henry said so. Stiles wrote it down. At the end of the 3rd week, Inspector Stiles closed his notepad and told the translator to inform Henry Yuan, Chen Wei Long, that his application for admission had been approved. Henry walked off the ferry at the San Francisco waterfront on a Tuesday morning in March 1910. He was carrying a name that was not his, a history that was not his, a village he had never visited, lodged in his memory like a second childhood. He was Chen Wei Long, son of a San Francisco-born merchant, American citizen by birthright, admitted to the country after 3 weeks of interrogation about a fictional kitchen's windows. He was Henry Yuan, son of a Taishan farmer, nephew of Jianming Yuan, who had built a railroad and been excluded from the country it connected, admitted through a system of purchased documents and memorized fictions because the legitimate door had been closed, and the paper door was the only door left. He walked up Sacramento Street looking for his uncle's laundry. Jim Yuan was 66 years old and still at the laundry. He had not died. He had contracted, not physically, still broad through the shoulders in the way of men who have done physical work for decades, but in some other dimension he had pulled in, reduced himself to the space the law allowed. He looked at Henry for a long time without speaking, then said something in the Taishan dialect about the family resemblance, about how Henry looked like Jim's brother around the eyes and the jaw. It was the recognition of a relative after a long separation across water and law and time. Jim made tea. They sat in the back of the laundry, and Jim told Henry what the city was and wasn't, what was possible and what wasn't, which streets were safer and which weren't, what the Geary Act meant in practice, and what the paper sun life required in terms of the sustained maintenance of a fictional identity that could not be allowed to slip in any official context, ever. Henry listened and understood that he had not crossed the Pacific to freedom, but to a different kind of constraint, more navigable than Taishan's constraints, but constraint nonetheless. requiring a particular kind of sustained attention that did not look like what it was. He went to work in the laundry. He became, as effectively as a man can, Chen Weilong in public and Henry Yuan in private, the doubling that the paper sun system required, not just different names, but different selves, one for the inspectors and the paperwork and the street, one for the back rooms and the family letters and the dreams. In Taishan, Suyin Yuan was 56 years old. She had been waiting for 36 years. This is a sentence that requires a moment. 36 years. She had been 20 years old when Jim left for California, 22 when she understood the separation was going to be longer than either of them had planned, 28 when the Exclusion Act passed, and Jim's letters explained as gently as he could manage in written characters that she could not come. She watched her neighbors' husbands come back from California. Some did come back, men who had accumulated enough savings to retire in Taishan and did not trust the American situation enough to stay. Some husbands sent money and did not come back. Some went entirely silent, and the wives in those cases did not know whether to mourn or to wait. Suyin waited. The letters came with decreasing frequency after 1900. Jim's hand had developed a slight tremor she could see in the brush strokes, and his letters were shorter, more careful, as though he was choosing each word with special attention to what it might have to carry. He was well. The laundry was well. He was saving money. He was looking into the merchant exemption, because if he could establish himself legally as a merchant rather than a laundryman, Suyin could come as a merchant's wife. The evidence was unclear on whether this would work. He was looking into it. After 1905, the letters stopped arriving through normal channels, then resumed through unofficial routes the community had developed. For several years there was silence, and in that silence, Suyin did what she had done for decades. She waited, and she managed the household, and she learned to carry the waiting as a permanent weight rather than a temporary burden, because a weight you know you will carry forever is lighter than one you keep being surprised to find you're still holding. The money continued to arrive, in amounts that varied by year. She was provided for. She was not poor. She was waiting in a direction, across the Pacific, toward San Francisco, toward a man who was real but unreachable, present in letters and money, but absent in every physical sense that matters to a marriage. This is what the law created. Not just the immediate exclusion of Chinese laborers from entry. That was the surface. Beneath the surface, the law created this: a man in San Francisco who could not become a citizen, who could not bring his wife, who was anchored to a laundry on Sacramento Street by the practical impossibility of leaving, and the equally practical impossibility of staying in the way that belonging would have required. A woman in Taishan who received money orders and occasional letters and spent her adult life oriented toward a man whose absence the law had manufactured. The Pacific Ocean between them was not geography. It was the law, made into water and distance. Jim Yuan died in 1921 at the age of 77. He had been in California for 56 years. He had never become a citizen. He had never seen Suyin again after the ship left Hong Kong in 1865. He left the laundry to Henry. He left a box of letters. Every letter Suyin had sent him since 1865, kept in order by date, tied with string that had been retied many times. There were 114 letters. Henry sent the box to Taishan. Suyin died in 1937. She was 93 years old. She had lived long enough to hear about the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. She had not lived long enough to see the Exclusion Act repealed. She had not lived long enough to know that in 1943, the United States Congress would decide, for reasons relating to wartime alliance and international embarrassment, rather than any reconsideration of the fundamental wrong, to allow 105 Chinese immigrants per year to enter the country. She had not lived long enough to know that this paltry concession was offered 61 years after the law that had made her a waiting woman rather than a wife. She died in Taishan, having crossed no ocean, having received 114 letters from a man who crossed one for her and could not cross it back. The Magnuson Act was signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on December 17, 1943. China was by this point an allied power fighting the same war America was fighting. The Chinese Exclusion Act was, as American diplomats stationed in Asia reported back to Washington, a propaganda gift to Japan, which was using it to argue to Chinese audiences that the United States regarded Chinese people as racially inferior and was therefore not a genuine ally. The argument was not without factual foundation, which made it effective. Roosevelt signed the repeal. 105 Chinese immigrants per year were allowed entry, not the 10,000 a year who had been building railroads in the 1860s, not the 30,000 who had entered California in a single year in the early 1870s. 105. Full removal of national origin quotas would not come until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The precedent the Chinese Exclusion Act had established did not disappear with its repeal. It demonstrated that immigration restriction based on race and national origin was legally permissible, that the courts would uphold it, and that the political constituency for it was reliable and replicable. The precedent was applied to Japanese immigrants with the Immigration Act of 1924. It was applied to Indian immigrants with the Barred Zone Act of 1917. It was applied systematically to every Asian immigrant group that attempted to enter the country in the first half of the 20th century, using the legal architecture that had been built for and tested on Chinese workers. The Chinese Exclusion Act was not an isolated piece of legislation. It was a model. Chinatowns across the American West were not built because Chinese families wanted to live in a specific kind of neighborhood. They were built because the structure of American law and practice left Chinese residents with no other option. Employment discrimination barred Chinese workers from most industries, forcing Chinese economic life into a narrow band of occupations: laundries, restaurants, domestic service, small retail. Housing covenants forced Chinese families into specific districts. The fires at Rock Springs and Tacoma had demonstrated what happened to Chinese residents who lived in dispersed communities without the protection of numbers. Chinatowns were defensive formations. They were survival zones constructed in response to a hostile environment, gradually developing the internal economy and culture that made them appear, to outside observers, like voluntary cultural expressions. They were not voluntary. They were the shape that exclusion made. Henry Yuen operated the laundry on Sacramento Street until 1932, when the Depression made it unviable. He was alive in 1943, when the Exclusion Act was repealed. He was alive in 1965, when the national origin quotas were abolished. He died in San Francisco in 1971. 61 years after he had walked off the ferry from Angel Island, with a name that wasn't his, and a village in his memory that he had never visited, having spent those 61 years becoming, fully and completely, a San Franciscan, a Californian, an American, in all the ways that mattered, and some that did not. He never officially corrected his immigration record. To correct it would have been to acknowledge the paper Sun system to authorities who were still, decades after his arrival, capable of using such acknowledgement as the basis for deportation proceedings. He died as Chen Weilong in the official records, and as Henry Yuen in the memories of his family and friends, and the community he had been part of for 6 decades. His children, American citizens by birth, knew the real name. They kept it alongside the paper name the way their father had kept it, as the private truth underneath the public necessity. Nellie Fong died in 1974. She had spent 50 years working in community legal services and immigration assistance in San Francisco's Chinatown, helping hundreds of families navigate the documentation requirements, the interrogations, the deportation proceedings, the citizenship applications that became possible after 1943, and more genuinely so after 1965. She had watched the legal structure of exclusion dismantle, law by law, over her lifetime, and she had watched the social and economic structures it had built persist well beyond the laws that created them, because the laws had done their work, and their work did not reverse simply because the laws were changed. She carried her certificate past the point where any law required her to carry it. She was right to do so, in the practical way of someone who has learned that formal repeal and lived reality move at different speeds. She was an American citizen who carried proof of her identity every day of her adult life, because her face and her history told anyone looking at her that her Americanness was the kind that required verification. The United States Congress passed resolutions expressing regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act in 2011 and 2012. The Senate passed its resolution in October 2011. The House passed its in June 2012. The resolutions expressed regret for the passage and enforcement of the Act and its subsequent extensions. They acknowledged the harm. They described the contributions of Chinese Americans to the development of the United States. Not apology, regret. The distinction matters because it determines whether anything follows from the acknowledgement, whether it carries any obligation, whether it implies any action, whether it means anything beyond the expression of a feeling about the past. Congress expressed regret. No remedy followed. 130 years after the act. 143 years after the photograph. Now let us return to that photograph one final time, because it is not done with us. Here is what the photograph does not show. It does not show Wei Guangzhen from Zhongshan, who told stories in the tunnels and made men laugh in the dark. It does not show Chen Bolin from Kaiping, who carried his wife's letter folded to near transparency in his coat pocket, and built the railroad with one hand while the other held the paper that connected him to the reason he was there. It does not show Liang Fuhai, 19 years old, whose name the railroad did not keep. It does not show the men who drilled through granite by candlelight for 2 years to drive the summit tunnel through a mountain that did not want to be tunneled. It does not show the men who worked under 40 feet of snow in the winter of 1866, who built their city underground and kept working while the world above was white and silent. It does not show the men who handled nitroglycerin with the careful and lethal expertise of people who understood that the margin between controlled explosion and uncontrolled explosion was a matter of attention and luck, and who maintained both for as long as they could. It does not show Jian Mingyuan, who was 23 years old when he blasted his first tunnel face, and 66 when he met his nephew at the door of a laundry in San Francisco. A man who had survived the railroad and the mobs and the Act and the Geary Act and the passage of time, who had sent 114 letters across the Pacific to a woman he would never see again, who had built the thing that connected the country and been excluded from the country it connected. The photograph does not show any of them because they were told to step aside. Not in 1869, when they were told to step out of the photograph. Not in 1882, when they were told to step out of the country. Not in 1892, when they were told to carry papers proving who they were. Not in 1910, when their nephews arrived at Angel Island and were detained in wooden barracks and interrogated for weeks about fictional villages and carved their testimony into the walls, because the walls were the only document that would receive it. Not in 1943, when Congress repealed the law for wartime diplomatic reasons and allowed 105 of them per year to exist in the country they had built. Not in 2012, when Congress expressed regret. The walls of Angel Island still hold the words of the men who crossed the ocean and sat in wire-meshed rooms and refused, in the way that human beings refuse when they have no other form of refusal available, to be made invisible. The words are carved deep. They have lasted. In 1963, a park ranger stopped a demolition. The poem survived because someone was paying attention at the right moment. The words will continue to last. The country built on their labor owes them more than regret. It owes them the photograph. Congress expressed regret in 2012, 130 years after the act, and 143 years after the photograph. The men are still not in the picture. The regret has not put them there.